Episode is called Breathless. It was the first day of school in September of 2012, and a 16-year-old girl named Emma stood at her locker in the tiny town of Thief River Falls, Minnesota. She had volleyball practice next, so she threw a water bottle, a deodorant stick, hair ties, and a few other items into her backpack. Emma was excited that summer was over and they were back in school, but really just because she was excited about sports, not so much for her classes. She had made the varsity volleyball team, and now she was anxious to get on the court with her teammates. Emma looked in the tiny mirror mounted on the inside of her locker door, and immediately she grimaced at her reflection. She touched up her eyeliner and pulled her hair back into a tight ponytail. Her acne was flaring up again, even though she was taking medication for it, so she put on some concealer to cover it up. Then she threw the makeup into her backpack and shut her locker. A few minutes later, Emma walked into the noisy school gymnasium and dropped her backpack behind the bleachers. She could hear the familiar squeaking of sneakers and the smacking of volleyballs as her friends warmed up for practice. Emma felt right at home as she ran out to join them. But about halfway through the practice, Emma began to feel really tired. And not the normal kind of tired from like working out or running around. Her feet felt really heavy and her heart was pounding. When she looked around, she saw her teammates did not seem tired, so Emma just pushed herself and continued running all the drills. But after a few more minutes, she felt so winded that she just had to stop. And so her teammates rushed past her as Emma knelt down on one knee to catch her breath. Emma was used to feeling very fit and strong, but now her chest felt tight and she could barely breathe. She staggered to her feet and stumbled over to the bleachers. Emma's head felt heavy as she held it in her hands. She felt a sharp pain in her throat every time she swallowed, and now she was starting to feel scared. Her coach walked over and asked Emma if she was okay. Emma silently shook her head no. Her coach placed the back of her hand on Emma's forehead, and she told Emma she was burning up and suggested she go home and rest. Emma nodded and then stood and slowly shuffled around the bleachers to pick up her backpack. She dug out her phone from inside and then called her mom and then told her she wasn't feeling good and needed to come home early. When Emma's mother arrived, she felt her daughter's forehead and saw she was burning up, so she drove Emma right to their family doctor. The doctor took Emma's vitals and discovered she definitely had a fever, with a temperature of 103 degrees Fahrenheit. So she was sick for sure. He tested to see if Emma had strep throat, a common illness among teenagers, but the test was negative. After reviewing her charts for a few minutes, the doctor explained to Emma and her mother that Emma probably had a fast-moving viral infection. He told her to go home and rest and that her symptoms should clear up in a couple of days. Emma was glad to hear that it wasn't anything serious. She didn't want to miss a lot of volleyball practices. But when Emma woke up the next day, she felt more tired than she ever had in her whole life. It was like her limbs just didn't want to move, and her lungs could barely take in any air. Emma cried out for her parents, Janet and Martin, and a few seconds later they ran into Emma's room, and the second they saw how sick Emma looked, they told her, "We're going to the emergency room right now." During the 25-mile drive to the hospital, Emma struggled to breathe. By the time they finally arrived, Emma was gasping for air as hospital staff helped her out of the car and onto a gurney. As a nurse wheeled Emma into a room, her mother squeezed her hand and her father followed close behind. The nurse's soft voice was very comforting as she asked Emma questions, but Emma struggled to answer even simple ones like where did she go to high school? Emma vaguely felt the prick of a needle in the crook of her elbow as the nurse attached an IV and drew several vials of blood. Then the nurse placed an oxygen mask over Emma's nose and mouth and picked up a phone. Emma could hear the seriousness in the nurse's voice. She wondered if maybe this was just how nurses sounded in the ER, or maybe this was something really bad. A few minutes later, the nurse wheeled her gurney to a room down the hall and positioned a large X-ray machine over Emma's chest while she lay there. Emma knew that the X-rays could not actually hurt her, but as the machine began to click and hum, Emma really started to feel terrified. What was wrong with her? When the nurse wheeled Emma back to her room after the X-ray, she turned down the harsh overhead lights and told Emma to rest while they waited for the results. Emma was grateful for the peace and quiet. She closed her eyes and immediately sank into a deep sleep. An hour later, Emma was startled awake as a doctor wheeled in a computer and dimmed the overhead lights, pulling up a digital image of her chest. Janet and Martin, Emma's parents, stood up from their chairs in the corner of the room as the doctor began to point to all these dark, cloudy spots on the image. The doctor told Emma and her parents that the grayish cloud on her lungs indicated a severe case of pneumonia. The doctor explained that they could treat the pneumonia with drugs, but the big question was what caused Emma's lungs to become so infected. It could be a bacteria, a virus, a fungus, or something else. Hopefully more tests would help them figure it out. But the doctor said that this small regional hospital was not equipped to run those type of tests. He was arranging for Emma to be transferred to the Sanford Medical Center in Fargo, North Dakota, almost 100 miles away. It was the closest hospital with a pediatric intensive care unit. Emma grabbed onto her mother's hand as an orderly came to wheel her into another ambulance. Volleyball practice suddenly seemed very far away. About 2 hours later, a physician at Sanford Medical named Dr. Sherry Richards rushed down the busy hall in the pediatric ICU and into Emma's room. Emma's mom sat next to her sleeping daughter, brushing hair out of Emma's face, while her father sat in the corner, anxiously bouncing his leg. Dr. Richards introduced herself to the parents and then walked up to examine Emma. And right away, she noticed Emma had very shallow breathing and bluish lips and fingertips, and then she gently touched Emma's hand and it was cold. These were all symptoms of Emma's pneumonia. Dr. Richards smiled at Janet and Martin and told them she was going to prescribe powerful antibiotics to suppress the infection in Emma's lungs. Now, she wasn't sure exactly what was causing the infection, but these antibiotics covered a broad spectrum of disease-causing agents, so hopefully the drugs would help Emma start to feel better, while Dr. Richards continued to look for more specific answers. But the next morning, less than 48 hours after Emma initially felt ill, her condition only seemed to be getting worse. She had an extremely high fever, and her breathing was shallow and rapid, and so very little oxygen was reaching her bloodstream. Dr. Richards needed to do something drastic. She asked Emma's parents for permission to place Emma on a ventilator, a machine that forces air into the lungs when someone is struggling to breathe. Emma would need to have a tube inserted through her windpipe so enough air and oxygen could reach her lungs. Her parents hated the idea, but watching Emma gulping for air, they told the doctor to do whatever it took to help their daughter. Dr. Richards checked in on Emma every day, hoping that with more oxygen, Emma's lungs would get better. But even with the help of the ventilator, Emma wasn't recovering. Emma's heart and other organs were not getting enough oxygen to function properly. Dr. Richards was perplexed. She said to a nurse how incredibly rare it was for a young, athletic high school student to be put on a ventilator. Sudden respiratory failure like this did not just happen out of the blue. The most likely cause for what was happening to Emma would be some kind of viral or bacterial infection, but Dr. Richards thought that was unlikely for one simple reason. None of her schoolmates were getting sick. It was just Emma. So Dr. Richards took a closer look into Emma's patient history to see if there was anything about her on an individual level that could spark any clues. By all accounts, she seemed like your average teenage girl whose only regular medication was a very common acne treatment, meaning it was extremely unlikely that Emma's current condition was caused by a rare side effect from this acne treatment. Also, Emma did not have any relevant allergies either. So, to cover all her bases, Dr. Richards ordered a wide range of tests. She wondered if maybe the respiratory issues were caused by a blood clot in Emma's lungs, or maybe she had undiagnosed rheumatoid arthritis that scarred her lungs. But every test Dr. Richards ran on Emma just came back negative. Dr. Richards was totally stumped. And so she suspected that whatever was happening to Emma had to be extremely rare. It was so uncommon she couldn't find any existing records of similar cases anywhere, which also meant she couldn't find a way to treat it. It quickly became obvious that the ventilator was not enough to stabilize Emma's breathing. After a few days, Dr. Richards switched her to a more powerful ventilator that pumped even more air into her lungs, but even that was still not enough. There was only one option left, a very powerful machine that is normally reserved for patients on the brink of death. A team from the famed Mayo Clinic flew to Fargo with a high-tech, refrigerator-sized device known as an ECMO machine. All the blood in Emma's body would now circulate through this ECMO machine, which essentially takes over the job of her heart and lungs. The ECMO machine required surgery to insert all the thin plastic tubes into Emma's body, and her mother immediately gave permission to do this surgery, knowing this could be Emma's only hope. As soon as Emma's surgery was done and she was successfully hooked up to the ECMO machine, Dr. Richards arranged to fly her back to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. There, Emma would be under the care of specialists who had experience treating patients who were as critically ill as Emma was. But this also meant she would now be 400 miles away from her home. As Dr. Richards watched the team roll Emma and the giant ECMO machine toward the airplane, she shook her head at the danger her young patient now faced. She was convinced that Emma's heart, lungs, and kidneys were so damaged that they would never function again without the help of this machine. Now, Emma's only hope of getting off the ECMO machine was to get new organs. But the wait for a 3-organ transplant could take months that she might not have. For now, the ECMO was saving Emma's life, but there was a catch. The longer she had to wait for new organs, the greater risk that she would die. Once Emma was settled in at the Mayo Clinic, her new doctor explained the situation to her. She was at the top of the priority list to receive her new organs, but there was no telling how long that might take. Emma fought to keep her emotions under control. In just a few short weeks, she'd gone from the varsity volleyball team to needing a machine to stay alive. It was almost overwhelming to process. But Emma refused to lay back and mope. She was determined to regain control of something in her life. So she told her doctor she wanted to walk. She saw the doctor look at her with amazement. He encouraged her to go for it, but he also gently told Emma that given her condition, he wasn't sure that she could even muster the energy to stand, let alone take a step. And even if she could, she'd have to drag along this massive ECMO machine and all the tubes and monitors that came with it. But as an athlete, Emma was familiar with the importance of a good attitude. She knew she was physically weak, but she was also very determined. With enough time and effort, she was certain she could eventually walk on her own. So Emma asked some nurses to help her sit up and place her feet on the floor. She was so dizzy that her head spun, and she had to lie down again almost immediately. But Emma refused to give up. She tried again the next day and sat on the edge of the bed a little longer. And the next day, she sat for even longer. Eventually, Emma was strong enough that she was able to actually stand up, albeit she had to hold on to her mom for support. And then it wasn't long after that Emma was straight up walking out of her room and standing in the hall without her parents' help. Finally, Emma managed to make it all the way down the 60-foot-long corridor to the hospital chapel. And there, Emma tasted her first solid food since she'd been hooked up to the ECMO machine. It was just a communion wafer, but Emma could not believe how good that dry, stale cracker tasted. One morning, after more than 6 months at the Mayo Clinic, Emma's doctor came into her room to review the latest readout from her ECMO machine. As he walked over to it, he smiled down at Emma, who was in bed tapping on her phone. The doctor felt so bad for Emma because she was in this impossible situation, but he was also very proud of Emma for really handling this situation with grace. She was so optimistic and so positive, even though most people would be totally devastated and depressed. The doctor looked at the numbers from the ECMO machine and had to do a double take. He wondered if he was actually misreading the data. Emma looked up from her phone and asked him what was going on, and Emma's doctor told her that her blood pressure, heart rate, and blood oxygen levels all seemed to be improving. He had no explanation for why this was happening, but given the numbers he was seeing, Emma's organs might have recovered enough to function without the help of the ECMO. Doctors still had no idea what had made Emma sick in the first place, but almost miraculously, she appeared to be getting over it. After more than 6 months on the ECMO machine, the tubes in Emma's body were finally removed and she was officially disconnected from the machine. She never got a transplant because she didn't need one. Her organs had mysteriously recovered all on their own. Finally, on a spring day in 2013, Emma left the hospital for good. She had been in the hospital for a total of 7 months with a mystery disease that had baffled some of the best doctors in the world. Now, Emma could return to normal life as an active teenager. But a dark shadow hung over Emma. The doctors had never figured out what was making her sick. So what was to stop it from striking her again, or somebody else in the future? 2 years later, Emma and her parents returned to the Mayo Clinic for a checkup. She'd been coming every 6 months since being discharged, and so far there were no lingering issues from her mystery disease. Emma cheerfully greeted the medical staff as a nurse led her down the hospital's halls into an exam room. While the nurse took Emma's vitals, she remarked how happy all the staff was that Emma had made this full recovery, but then the nurse's face grew serious. The nurse told Emma that there was actually a 12-year-old girl at the hospital currently being treated for the same bizarre symptoms that Emma had experienced. Her lungs had stopped working and nobody knew why, and just like Emma had been, this 12-year-old was currently hooked up to an ECMO machine while awaiting an organ transplant. Emma was shocked to hear this. She held back tears as the memories of her own time on the ECMO machine came flooding back to her. She wanted to do everything she could to help this girl, and so Emma asked if maybe she could meet with the girl's parents. And sure enough, a couple of hours later, Emma and her parents sat down with the 12-year-old girl's parents in the hospital cafeteria. And over some hot coffee, they compared their respective histories. At first, the two girls' cases didn't seem to actually have that much in common. But then Emma remarked that she hoped this other girl at least didn't have the same skin problems that she, Emma, had dealt with when she was younger. The girl's mom laughed and said that her daughter had acne, but not any worse than any other teenager. The mother said that she was taking some medication for it, but it was an extremely common medication. It would turn out that both this girl and Emma were taking the same acne medication, called Bactrim, also known generically as TMP-SMX. The families would shake hands and go their separate ways, and then unfortunately, the 12-year-old girl would eventually die from the mystery condition. Three years later, in March of 2018, Emma, who was now 21 years old, sat at her desk in her modest one-bedroom apartment, drinking her morning coffee and reading the news on her laptop. She clicked on a headline and her jaw dropped. She could not believe what she was seeing. It was a story about a 16-year-old high school student in Wichita, Kansas, named Z Uwadya. She was an athlete who played on several sports teams, but then her lungs just suddenly stopped working, and now Z was relying on an ECMO machine to survive. Emma couldn't believe the similarities between Z's story and her own. It made Emma also think back to that little 12-year-old girl who died a couple years back. Since then, Emma had heard about another teenager experiencing the same thing, and she too had also taken Bactrim, or TMP-SMX. Emma wondered if maybe Z, this person in this headline, was taking Bactrim as well. For years now, this suspicion about Bactrim had lingered in the back of Emma's mind, and now she was more certain than ever that this common medication was what had made them all so sick. Emma found an email address for the doctor who was treating Z, and she wrote to her immediately. Dr. Jenna Miller, who was caring for Z at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri, was catching up on paperwork when her inbox pinged. There was a message from a woman named Emma who said that she'd experienced something similar to Z, and she wanted to know if Z had taken Bactrim, because Emma had taken Bactrim, and so maybe that was a commonality. On one level, Dr. Miller thought it was highly unlikely that such a common drug could cause such a horrific reaction. Bactrim, or TMP-SMX, is the 6th most prescribed antibiotic in the entire United States. It's used to treat many different conditions. Then she remembered something. She scoured Z's files to confirm it. For several weeks before Z was admitted to the hospital, she had been suffering from a urinary tract infection. And the antibiotic that she was taking to treat it was Bactrim. Dr. Miller wrote back to Emma and told her that she very well might have just solved the mystery behind Z's condition and Emma's own horrible illness. It turned out all the girls with this mystery illness had taken Bactrim, TMP-SMX, shortly before being hospitalized. And when the doctors examined images of the girls' lung tissue samples, they discovered that they had all suffered the same kind of tissue damage. For some reason, the Bactrim was systematically destroying the cells responsible for breathing. Over the next 4 years, Dr. Miller searched patient records across the country for people who'd suffered inexplicable respiratory failure shortly after taking this drug. They identified 19 other cases, mostly young men and women under the age of 20. 6 had died, including Z. Uwadya. No one knows why the antibiotic sometimes triggers this rare lung destruction, but Dr. Miller and her colleagues suspect that in rare cases, people's bodies have a potentially deadly allergic reaction to the drug. Today, Bactrim, or TMP-SMX, is still widely prescribed, but acute lung failure is now listed as a potential side effect. Emma is now 26 years old, and she works as a nurse who cares for patients who've just had heart and lung transplants. Emma knows that because of her reaction to Bactrim, which caused all this damage in her body, she can never be a serious athlete again. She gets winded after climbing a couple flights of stairs. But considering that she very nearly died, she doesn't mind at all. At 11 p.m. on August 10, 2003, 19-year-old Sonia Ivanov and her best friend Timuri Tworak were walking down a street that was lined with a few shops, bars, and houses in Nome, Alaska. Both young women had long, dark hair, and they were dressed almost the same in jeans, tennis shoes, and t-shirts. But Sonia was quite a bit taller. She was 5 foot 11 inches tall, and her height made her stand out no matter what she was wearing. Even though it was 11 o'clock at night, the sun was still out and shining overhead, because Nome, Alaska is less than 150 miles from the Arctic Circle, and that far north, at that time of the summer, the sun doesn't actually set until close to midnight. Sonia and Timuri were accustomed to the long summer days and the midnight sunsets because they'd spent their entire lives in Northwest Alaska. They were both Alaska Natives, which is a term used to define the multiple groups of Alaska's indigenous people. And they had both grown up over 100 miles south of Nome in a tiny village that was made up almost entirely of Alaska Natives. But not long after Sonia had graduated high school a year earlier, she had moved to Nome, and Timuri had followed her soon after that. And as Sonia and Timuri walked down the street that night, they still felt like they were living in a big city. In reality, Nome was just a small, remote town that was home to only about 3,500 people, but it was still a lot bigger than where Sonia and Timuri had come from. And Nome's residents were a collection of Alaska Natives, as well as people who had grown up in town and others who had traveled there from far away to live in a place that a lot of people called America's Last Frontier. Sonia and Timuri walked past a bar, and they could hear music and laughter coming from inside. Then they turned off the main road and onto a side street and walked over to a friend's small wooden house. Sonia and Timuri stepped up onto the raised porch, and then Sonia knocked on the door. And then a moment later, their friend opened the door and stretched up on her toes to reach Sonia's shoulders and gave Sonia a big hug. Then Sonia and Timuri headed inside to the cramped living room, flopped down on the couch, and settled in for a night of board games with friends. And just a moment later, a young woman about Sonia's age walked into the living room from the kitchen and handed Sonia a can of beer. Sonia cracked open the beer, took a swig, and smiled. When Sonia had first moved to Nome from the village she grew up in, her parents had been worried that she was too young and naive to handle city life. Everybody in their small village knew Sonia, and all of the adults there looked out for all the kids. And Sonia had been a star basketball player at her high school, so she was even kind of famous in her own little town. And her parents really hoped she would stay at least a little longer in a place where she was loved, protected, and admired. But Sonia had told her parents that she felt like she had to go to Nome to get a job that would let her save up enough money to go to college. because for most of her life, she dreamed of going off to college and experiencing new places and learning about new things. Sonia was outgoing, she was funny, and almost always in a very good mood. And so when she had arrived in Nome, she quickly landed work at a healthcare facility and she made a close group of friends. But she still felt connected to her roots because Timmery and her shared a small house, and Sonia's sister and brother-in-law lived close by. So pretty soon after Sonia had moved away and kind of found her place in Nome, her parents relaxed, and they were happy that their daughter seemed to be thriving in her new home. But what Sonia hadn't told her parents, or really anyone other than her best friend Timmery, was that she dreamed of a lot more than just going to college. She dreamed of making enough money to move away to Hawaii. Sonia loved her family, and she was proud of her Alaska Native heritage. In fact, when she had first moved to Nome, she had entered the Arctic Native Brotherhood pageant, which was an event where young people celebrated their native culture and spoke about important native issues of the time. But as much as Sonia loved the place and the culture she came from, she had gotten tired of the dark, cold winters in Northwest Alaska, those times when the sun was only up for a few hours and temperatures regularly dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So now Sonia liked to imagine herself on a warm, sunny beach in Hawaii, listening to the waves crash onto the sand. She knew her family would be sad to see her leave, but she just felt like going somewhere far away was something she had to do while she was still young. In the living room, Sonia drank her beer, she laughed and played a board game with her friends, and they all talked about work and guys and girls they had crushes on like most groups of teenagers do. But then, at around midnight, the group fell silent for a second, because they heard a police siren wailing on a street nearby. Sonia and Timmery almost always felt safe in Nome, but there were times when they would hear police sirens that reminded them they were not in their little home village anymore. And Sonia's sister and her brother-in-law, who lived near Sonia, told her never to ignore her surroundings. Because in Nome, like across Alaska and the rest of the United States, Alaska Native women and Native American women were assaulted, abducted, and murdered at rates that were higher than the national average. And while the group of teenagers sat in Sonia's friend's living room that night, Officer Matt Owens of the Nome Police was the one who was blaring the siren in his SUV while he was on his way to respond to a domestic violence call nearby. Officer Owens was originally from Florida, and he had noticed during his few years on the Nome police force that long summer nights often led people to drink, stay up late, and get into trouble a lot more than they ever did during the winter. But back at Sonia's friend's house, not long after the sound of the siren had faded, the group of teenagers put any thought of the police out of their minds, and Sonia and her friends got back to talking, laughing, and playing their board game. And then, at about 1 a.m. on August 11th, 2 hours after Sonia had arrived, she stood up from the couch and decided it was time for her to head home. Sonia said goodnight to the group, and Timmery said she was actually going to stay for a bit longer and that most likely she would just crash there for the night, so she would see Sonia at their place sometime the next day. Then Sonia and Timmery shared what they called their best friend goodbye ritual. They each tapped 2 of their fingers on the other's shoulder, then kissed their fingers, pointed them at the sky, and said, "Peace out, pal," to each other. Sonia opened the door and stepped outside. And as she started walking home, she thought to herself that she really needed to convince Timmery to come with her to Hawaii, because she couldn't imagine being there without her best friend who she had known for basically her whole life. Just after 1 a.m., so a few minutes after Sonia had left her friend's house, Sonia turned onto the main drag that cut through the center of town, and she walked along the side of the road. The sun had finally set, and it was about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. A light rain had started to fall, and Nome looked like it was covered in mist. And as much as Sonia had gotten sick of the cold Alaska winters, she loved rainy Alaska summer nights like this one. So she decided to take her time walking home and to enjoy being outside in the rain. She walked past the bar, and she still heard music coming from inside. Then she walked a little bit further past an old house that overlooked the main street, and as she walked by, she heard someone call her name from the dark. Sonia was startled, and she felt her shoulders tense up. Then she turned and saw an older woman she knew sitting on the front porch smoking a cigarette. And Sonia laughed at herself for being scared. She exhaled and relaxed her shoulders. The woman smiled and asked Sonia how she was doing. Sonia said she was doing fine, and then she told the woman to have a good night and waved goodbye. Sonia kept walking down the street, and as she did, she felt the rain falling on her face. Then at some point, she heard people coming out of the bar that she had passed a little ways back, and she realized it must be getting late. But Sonia didn't have to work the next day, so she could just go home and sleep in as late as she wanted to, and the thought of that made her smile. Then, as Sonia approached a brightly lit gas station, she heard a car coming up behind her. So she stepped even more to the side of the road to make sure the car could pass her, but the car pulled up right next to her and stopped. The passenger side window rolled down, the driver leaned across the seat and called out to Sonia. And so Sonia, she stopped walking, and then she looked at the driver and actually approached the car. Sonia then leaned in through the open window and talked to the driver for a bit longer, and then Sonia climbed into the passenger seat and shut the door. At around 5 p.m. on August 11th, so about 15 hours after Sonia had gotten into that car, Timmery came home from work. She was exhausted because she had stayed up late with her friends and then gone into work without sleeping much. She had come back to her and Sonia's house briefly that morning before heading to her job, and she hadn't seen Sonia, but she didn't think much of it. There was a chance Sonia had gotten up early and gone out for the day, or she might have run into friends on her way home and ended up staying somewhere else, which wasn't out of the ordinary for Sonia and Timmery, and neither of them had cell phones, so they didn't always keep in regular contact when they were apart. But hours after Timmery had gotten home from work, Sonia still had not come by the house or called, so Timmery decided to check in with Sonia's sister. Timmery called her on the landline and asked if she or her husband had seen or heard from Sonia in the last 24 hours. Sonia's sister said no, but she didn't sound worried at all. Sonia was 19 years old, and her sister knew she liked to go out and have a good time with friends, and she also knew there was a guy or two Sonia had been seeing. So she told Timmery that Sonia was probably just out and would most likely be home sometime soon. And so that night, Timmery went to bed kind of early because she was still worn out from her day, and she figured she'd either hear Sonia come home later that night or she would see her in the morning. But by the following afternoon, Timmery still had not seen or heard anything from Sonia, and now Timmery was starting to get worried. She called Sonia's sister again, but again, the sister said she had not heard from Sonia. And so Timmery decided that she had to tell the police. But Timmery had grown up in a small village that did not have a traditional police department, so she didn't even really know how to go about telling the police what was happening. And so she decided it would be best for her to just go to the police station and talk to someone in person. Timmery threw on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, she slipped on her tennis shoes, and she headed towards the police station in the center of town. The rain had stopped, but it was still cool and gray outside. It only took a few minutes for Timmery to get to the police station. She walked inside the small building that was lit up with bright fluorescent lights, and she was greeted by Officer Matt Owens, the Florida native who had responded to the domestic violence call when Timmery and Sonia had been at their friend's house. Officer Owens asked Timmery what she needed, and Timmery would tell him that, Sonia, her friend, had gone missing and she hadn't heard or seen from her since she had left to walk home over 24 hours earlier. Officer Owens was just about 29 years old, and he had brown hair, a goatee, and a warm smile. He tried to put Timmery at ease because it was obvious she was very upset, and he told her that the police had not gotten any reports about anything out of the ordinary over the last day. Then another officer who was sitting nearby overheard the conversation, and he walked over to them. He said the best explanation was probably that her friend had gone out partying, and she was either still partying or recovering somewhere with friends. But Timmery said that Sonia had only had one beer on the night they were last hanging out, so it wasn't like she was just wandering around town drunk. But the officer said there still probably wasn't anything to worry about. Then one of the officers took down Sonia's name and Timmery's personal information, and then told Timmery they would call her if they heard anything. Timmery thanked the officers, she turned around and walked out of the station. But as she headed home, she felt like she'd been totally blown off. And she didn't like to buy into stereotypes, but she knew a lot of her friends and family believed that the cops in town would do as little as possible when it came to helping Alaska Native women, and she really hoped that was not the case. Not long after Timmery had left the police station, the phone in the police station rang, and Officer Matt Owens answered it. Sonia's boss was on the other line, and he was calling to say that Sonia had not come into work that day, and he was worried because Sonia never missed work or was even late without calling first. Owens hung up the phone and took a deep breath. Then he got up and walked the short distance across the station to the chief of police's office. The chief waved Owens in and asked him what was going on. And Owens told him about Timmery's visit, about her friend Sonia, and now Sonia's boss had just called. And so Owens said they might have a legitimate missing persons case on their hands. At 8:30 p.m. on August 13th, the day after Timmery had gone to the police station, a volunteer firefighter was driving on an old dirt road about 5 miles outside of Nome. After the chief of police had talked to Officer Owens about Sonia, he contacted the fire department and a couple of community groups to help organize a search for Sonia. And the volunteer firefighter had gotten the call, went right out to his car, and started driving in and around the city to help the search however he could. He was driving slowly, looking out the windshield and both windows, trying not to miss anything that might lead him to Sonia. The road he was on had once been very busy when Nome had experienced a gold rush all the way back in the 1890s, but now the roads around the old gold mines were pretty much abandoned and almost nobody ever drove on them. But most people in town knew that young couples still would sometimes find their way out to the abandoned roads to spend some time together alone, and that the area near the mines had become a kind of lover's lane. And the volunteer firefighter thought, maybe Sonia and a guy she was seeing had come out that way, and maybe they'd gotten stuck in the mud after the rainstorm or something like that. The volunteer firefighter continued to scan both sides of the narrow road, but all he could see was bushes and thick underbrush stretching out in both directions. But then suddenly something caught his eye and he slammed on the brakes. He looked out the driver's side window and stared into a bush. He thought something was out there, but he couldn't tell what it was. So he turned off the engine, he got out of his car, and walked over to those bushes. Then he crouched down and peered inside the bushes, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His stomach turned and he felt like he might get sick, but he made himself turn around and run back to his car. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the car, turned it around, and sped down the old narrow mining road and back into town as fast as he could. Less than 30 minutes later, the same volunteer firefighter was heading back to the bushes on the side of the old mining road, this time in the passenger seat of a Nome police SUV that was being driven by Officer Brian Wayavana. Officer Wayavana headed down the road and stopped when the volunteer fireman told him to. Then Wayavana stepped out of the SUV and walked over to the bushes by himself. Wayavana was in his mid-30s with dark black hair and a black mustache, and he smoked cigarettes regularly while on the job. He would often say that being a cop in Nome was 39.5 hours a week of sheer boredom and a half hour of oh shit. And this definitely felt like an oh shit moment to him. Wayavana crouched down, and when he looked into the bushes, he hoped his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the sun was still bright enough for him to see clearly, and he knew he was staring at the body of Sonia Ivanov. Wayavana stood up, but then he quickly bent over again and put his hands on his knees and breathed in several times through his nose. Wayavana knew Sonia's sister and brother-in-law quite well, and he couldn't imagine having to tell them what he had just discovered. But before Wayavana could worry about that, he had to act fast. He knew that the small Nome Police Department was not equipped to handle the forensics investigation required in a case like this. They would need help from the crime lab and the Alaska State Troopers. But both of those groups worked out of Anchorage, which was over 500 miles away, and there was no road that directly connected Anchorage to Nome, so it could take them a while to get there. Wayavana went back to his SUV, he opened the door and grabbed the radio. He called in to the officers on duty and told them he needed everyone to help him come lock down a crime scene and to make sure that nothing happened to it until help from Anchorage arrived. On August 14th, so a day after Sonia's body had been discovered, criminalist Carrie Cathcart from the Alaska State Crime Lab in Anchorage sat in the passenger seat of Officer Wayavana's SUV as they wound their way down the dirt mining road just outside of Nome. When Nome police had called the crime lab, the case was handed over to Cathcart. She booked a flight and had arrived in Nome earlier that morning. And while Nome police had waited for Cathcart to get there, they covered Sonia's body and most of the surrounding area with tarps to keep the crime scene as untouched as they possibly could. And Nome police officers had taken shifts guarding the crime scene to make sure nobody came near it. Wayavana eased off the gas and stopped the car several yards away from the crime scene. Cathcart looked out and she saw the tarps covering the area. She was used to visiting scenes days after a crime had taken place because traveling in Alaska often just took a lot longer than it would in other parts of the United States. Cathcart got out of the SUV, slipped on a pair of gloves, and followed Weyavana to the bushes on the side of the road. Cathcart wore hiking boots, a windbreaker over a dark shirt, and she had long blonde hair. Weyavana called another officer over, and together they removed a tarp from the bushes. Then they walked away from Cathcart and removed the remaining tarps that covered other parts of the crime scene. Cathcart stared down at Sonia's lifeless body inside of the bushes. Cathcart had worked homicide cases and other violent crimes for a few years, but it still hit her very hard when she saw victims as young as Sonia. As Cathcart approached the body, the most obvious thing that stood out about Sonia's body was that she was naked, except for a sock on one of her feet. But there were no clothes or scraps of torn fabric anywhere in the area. Then Cathcart moved in closer to get a better look. They would have to do a full autopsy and examination, but it was pretty clear to her right away that Sonia had died from a gunshot at close range. Cathcart asked an officer if Nome police had found bullet casings in the area, but the officer said they hadn't really found anything before they locked the site down and contacted Anchorage for help. Cathcart made her way back to the road and started scanning the dirt. She saw sets of tire tracks that looked like they matched a police SUV, like the one Weyavana was driving, but then she stopped cold and shouted for Weyavana to come look at something. Weyavana walked over to Cathcart on the road, and she pointed to a set of tire tracks in the dirt. He didn't really know why she was showing them to him, but then she motioned for him to come look closer, and she said the tracks were most likely from a truck, but importantly, it looked like the track had mismatched tires. This, of course, would make it much easier for the police to find this truck, especially because they were already starting with a small number of people who lived in Nome to begin with. So Weyavana made a note about the mismatched tires in his notebook. Then Cathcart followed those tire tracks back down the road towards the spot where Sonia's body was. Weyavana walked right behind her. Cathcart stepped over to the bushes right on the side of the road. She squinted her eyes and looked as closely as she could at every branch, and a slight smile began to come across her face. She turned to Weyavana and motioned for him to look at what she had just seen. And on one of the branches, she pointed to a streak of blue paint that she was almost certain had come from an automobile. So now Weyavana believed if he could just track down a blue truck with mismatched tires, he would have a good chance of finding Sonia's killer. In the days following Carrie Cathcart's examination of the crime scene, Nome police fanned out across the city. They spoke to Sonia's friends, her sister and brother-in-law, and anybody willing to come forward to say they had seen Sonia around the time she had disappeared. Officer Weyavana had met with Timmery the night Sonia's body had been discovered, but now he wanted to meet with her again to see if she might have any information that could lead him to the owner of a blue truck with these mismatched tires. So, on a warm August morning, Weyavana knocked on the door of Timmery and Sonia's house. Timmery opened the door, and Weyavana could see that her face was puffy and her eyes were bloodshot. It was clear she had been crying. Timmery led Weyavana into the small front room of the house. The place was messy, like a teenager's bedroom might be. There were clothes hanging on chairs and empty soda cans all over the coffee table. Timmery sat down on the couch, and Weyavana cleared off a chair and sat down across from her. Timmery was glad that it was Weyavana who had come to the house to talk to her. Timmery knew that Weyavana knew Sonia's sister, so Timmery believed Weyavana would do everything he could to find out who had killed Sonia. Weyavana started by just asking Timmery if she was okay, but she just shook her head and tried to fight off tears. Then he asked her if Sonia had any enemies or somebody who might have been angry with her. But Timmery said Sonia was one of the happiest, easygoing people she'd ever known, and everybody who had met her liked her right away. But then Timmery trailed off in the middle of a sentence, and she looked surprised, like she'd just thought of something that she believed she should have thought of a lot earlier. Weyavana asked her what was going on, and Timmery leaned forward on the couch, and she said there was a guy who Sonia had kind of hung out with a couple of times, and she knew they had kissed a couple of times, but it really wasn't anything serious. But Timmery said the guy was really into Sonia, but Sonia was not really into him. So Weyavana asked who this guy was, and Timmery would say it was a friend of theirs named Kunuk Angsuk. Then Timmery said that Kunuk was usually the nicest guy in the world, like a big teddy bear, but he did have a temper, and he could fly off the handle when he got mad. Officer Weyavana thanked her for the information. Then he asked Timmery if she happened to know what kind of car Kunuk drove, and she said he drove a blue truck. Weyavana's eyes lit up. He couldn't believe he'd possibly found the person he was looking for so quickly. He thanked Timmerie again, and then he headed out of her house, got into his SUV, and drove down the street to the police station. And when he filled in the chief of police about what he had just learned, the chief set things in motion for them to impound and search Kunuk's blue truck. It took a few days to get everything in order, but then Weyavana, Officer Matt Owens, other members of the Nome police, and the criminalist Carrie Cathcart searched the truck, and they were stunned by what they found. Kunuk's truck was indeed blue, and it had mismatched tires that fit with the tracks that Cathcart had found on the mining road near Sonia's body. But that wasn't all. One of the truck's tires had blood spatter on it, and inside the truck, they found multiple rifles and a tarp that was covered in blood. And so after this discovery, police felt like they had found their killer. In late August, so a couple of weeks after Sonia had been found, Nome police had more than enough evidence to make Sonia's friend Kunuk their prime suspect. So Weyavana and another officer drove out to Kunuk's house. When police had taken his truck, Kunuk knew they would be back soon to talk to him, so he did his best to stay calm as he let the investigators back into his house. Kunuk had short brown hair, and he wore jeans and a yellow t-shirt, and he had a silver earring in his left ear. Kunuk sat down in a chair in the front room of his house, and the officers stayed standing. Weyavana didn't waste any time. He asked Kunuk when was the last time he'd seen Sonia. And Kunuk thought about it for a second, and then said the last time he saw her was maybe 2 weeks before she died. And Kunuk would say that he and Sonia didn't really even talk when he last saw her, that really they had just kind of crossed paths in town. After this answer, the other officer who was there with Weyavana asked why Kunuk had a bloody tarp in his truck and why was there blood spatter on one of his tires. Kunuk started tapping his foot on the floor, and he looked away from the cops, and without making eye contact, he told them that he'd been out hunting 70 miles away at the time of Sonia's death, and that's why the rifles and the bloody tarp were in his truck, and the blood on the tarp was just animal blood. But the officer pressed Kunuk again about the blood spatter on his tire. And this time, Kunuk did look back at the officer, and he would say that he'd run over a rabbit or some other kind of small animal when he was driving out to go hunting, and so the blood on the tire must have just been from that. The officers were totally skeptical of this answer, but they stayed neutral and continued to question Kunuk a bit longer, and then when they were finally done, the officers were convinced that this was their guy. The evidence against Kunuk was solid, and the running over the rabbit story just seemed like a convenient excuse he'd made up on the spot. So Weyavana asked Kunuk to submit to a DNA test, and he told Kunuk if he was innocent like he said he was, a DNA test was the best way to prove that. Kunuk continued to tap his foot on the floor, but then he looked at Weyavana and he nodded and said he would submit samples for the test. Weyavana knew he would have to wait for the results from this DNA test and for the results from the test that the crime lab was going to run on the blood found on Kunuk's truck and on the tarp. But Weyavana hoped that soon he would be able to tell Sonia's sister and the rest of Sonia's family and her friends that they had found Sonia's killer. In late August, so almost 3 weeks after Sonia's murder, her body was returned to the small village where she had grown up. And her family and friends there had a funeral service and an outdoor vigil to celebrate Sonia's life and to mourn the life she never got to live. At the vigil, people who knew and loved her most talked about how happy and kind Sonia had been and how much her community and her culture had meant to her. And they said they wanted police to bring this case to a close quickly and to make sure the person who had killed Sonia was brought to justice. But they knew that even if that happened, the village would never fully heal from what had been done to Sonia. At around 2 a.m. on a day in early September, about a week after the vigil, Officer Weyavana sat in his SUV in a parking lot off the main street in Nome. He cracked his window, took a long drag off a cigarette, and exhaled the smoke out into the early morning air. Just like Sonia's friends and family, Weyavana hoped the case would be solved soon, and he had really believed that Sonia's friend Kunuk was the killer. But in the weeks following Kunuk's interview, parts of the investigation had kind of come to a halt. Test results from the tarp found in Kunuk's truck revealed that the blood on the tarp was animal blood, just like Kunuk had said, and several of Kunuk's friends said they had been with him when he was hunting on the day of Sonia's murder. Weyavana still was not ready to move on from Kunuk as a suspect, But while he waited for results from Koenig's DNA test to come back, the case suddenly didn't seem as open and shut as it had just a couple of weeks earlier. And now, the investigation team on this case had been reduced to just Weyavana and one other Nome officer. And Weyavana was stuck working nights while the other investigator worked days. So Weyavana sat in an empty parking lot near an empty street in the dead quiet of the morning, and he felt like he wasn't doing anything to help. Then he leaned over and grabbed a file folder from the passenger seat. Inside the folder were all of the notes that he and other officers had compiled during interviews they'd conducted following Sonia's murder. He flipped through the notes and tried to look at everything with fresh eyes, just in case he'd missed something. And as he read over a page right in the middle of the files, he almost gasped out loud. Weyavana was reading comments made by a woman who claimed she had seen Sonia get into a vehicle near a gas station at the same time that Sonia was believed to have disappeared. But for some reason, this woman's statement had never been followed up on. And so later that day, Weyavana, who was bleary-eyed and fighting off sleep, headed to that woman's house to talk to her. The woman said early on the morning of the murder, she had been smoking on her porch when Sonia had walked by and she had called out to her. The two of them had talked a bit, and then she watched as Sonia walked further down the street, got into a vehicle, and drove off. Then the woman gave a detailed description of the vehicle Sonia had climbed into, and it was not a blue truck. Weyavana thanked the woman and then rushed back to the police station where he told the chief of police all this new information he'd discovered, and the chief immediately put more officers back on the case, and they all went on a search to find this new vehicle that this woman had described. Just before 3 a.m. on September 23rd, so a few weeks after Weyavana had spoken to that woman, Officer Matt Owens, the Florida native, stood near a gravel pit down the road from where Sonia had been found. And in this gravel pit, Officer Owens saw a vehicle that matched the description of the one that woman had seen Sonia get into. Owens quickly called into the station and let them know what he'd found, and immediately other officers rushed out to the scene. But just minutes later, Officer Owens was on his cell phone to the police station again, but this time he was out of breath and he was running for his life. He kept shouting that gunshots had rung out right after he'd approached this vehicle in the gravel pit, and so now he was taking cover, but he needed backup fast. Not long after that, Weyavana and other members of the force arrived at the gravel pit, and they saw that Owens was crouched down behind some bushes nearby. They leapt out of their cars and they fanned out all across the area looking for whoever had been shooting at Officer Owens, but they never found anyone. And so after the police had secured the area and made sure it was safe, they all reconvened with Officer Owens over at the gravel pit, and sure enough, inside of it was this car that Owens had found and called in. And they noticed the driver's side window was completely shattered, very likely from one of the rounds that had just been fired at Officer Owens. That day, the police would conduct a full search of this vehicle, and that search would lead them right to Sonia's killer. Based on evidence found at the crime scene, interviews conducted throughout the investigation, and evidence discovered from the vehicle that Officer Owens found in the gravel pit, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened in the early morning hours of August 12, 2003, the day Sonia Ivanov was murdered. Just after 1 a.m., the killer drove slowly down the street in the center of Nome. Light rain fell on the windshield, and the mist gave the whole town kind of an eerie glow. The killer heard music coming from the bar, and they watched as a few drunk people stumbled outside. The killer laughed and just kept cruising down the street. And in the bright lights from the gas station up ahead, the killer saw Sonia walking on the side of the road. It was hard to miss the very beautiful 5-foot 11-inch tall teenager. The killer grinned, and they felt their hearts start to race a bit. Then they drove right past Sonia and hit the brakes. Then the killer rolled down the passenger window just as Sonia walked by, and they called out to her. Sonia stopped, walked over, and leaned in through the open window. The killer smiled and asked if Sonia wanted a ride home. Sonia liked walking in the rain, but there was a chance the storm could pick up quickly and get a lot worse, and it was getting late, so she said sure, she'd love a ride. The killer told her to hop inside, and so she did. She opened the door, got into the passenger seat, and then once Sonia was inside, the killer rolled up her window, they locked the doors, and drove down the road. But when they got to the point in the road where the killer should have turned to go to Sonia's house, they just kept on driving. Sonia said, "Hey, you missed the turn," but the killer just looked at her and smiled and then hit the gas. Sonia started to get scared and she asked the killer what they were doing, but the killer just told her to be quiet. When they reached the outskirts of town, the killer turned off the main road onto an old dirt road. Sonia desperately wanted to get out, but they were going so fast and she was just too scared to do anything. Finally, the killer slowed down and pulled into some bushes on the side of the dirt road and parked. Then the killer got out. Sonia tried to open her door, but she couldn't unlock it, and then she looked up out her window and she saw the killer standing there in the moonlight. Sonia screamed, and at the same time, the killer opened the door, they dragged her outside, and then wrapped their arms around her from behind. Sonia was tall and strong and fast, and so right away she began using all her strength to try to get out from the killer's grasp, and at some point she began leaning forward and bucking her legs out behind her, and she was able to get out of the killer's grip. But before Sonia could actually run away to freedom, the killer drew a .22 caliber pistol from their waistband and fired. And that bullet struck Sonia square in the back of the head. She fell to the ground, dead. Without wasting any time, the killer ran over and stripped off all of Sonia's clothes, except for one sock that they just overlooked. Then the killer dragged Sonia's body into a nearby bush. The killer went back to the road, grabbed Sonia's clothes and tossed them into the trunk. Then the killer closed the trunk, took a deep breath, calmed themselves down, and got back into the driver's seat. Then they drove away from the murder scene inside of their Nome Police Department SUV. Officer Matt Owens of the Nome Police Department killed Sonia. It turned out that woman who was smoking on her porch and then called out to Sonia on the night she disappeared, well, she saw Sonia get into a vehicle, and that vehicle was a police SUV. But the woman said she had not seen which one of the officers was driving the SUV at the time. The mismatched tire tracks that had been found at the murder scene turned out to be from a truck that a young man and woman had been driving, and the couple had just gone out to Lover's Lane on this mining road around the same time that Sonia was murdered. They had nothing to do with her murder. But the blue paint that criminalist Carrie Cathcart had found on the bushes ended up matching blue paint from the Nome Police Department insignia that was on all of their squad vehicles. And when Officer Owens had heard about this paint being found, and about the woman who said she saw Sonia drive off with a cop, he went out and drove the police SUV that he'd been driving the night he killed Sonia out to the gravel pit and dumped it there. Then later, he went back and reported finding the dumped SUV in hopes that this would eliminate any suspicion towards him. And Officer Owens would say that he thought someone from town must have stolen the police SUV and then driven it out to the mining road where they killed Sonia. And Owens was the one who shattered the SUV's window and then called the station to say he was being shot at, to make it seem like whoever had really killed Sonia was now monitoring this vehicle and gonna kill anybody who went near it. But other Nome police officers and the Alaska State Troopers saw right through Owens' lies. After finding him at the gravel pit, crouched down behind some bushes as if he was being shot at, the general consensus was, this looks staged. And so when they got out and they talked to Owens and he described who was shooting at him and from where, it just didn't really add up. And they searched the area and of course didn't find any shooter. And also just generally, the other officers just didn't buy the idea that someone from town would have the audacity to steal a police SUV and then go commit a murder with the SUV in tow. It just didn't make sense. Also, criminalist Carrie Cathcart very early on had said that she believed whoever had killed Sonia had a deep understanding of how to sanitize a crime scene because there was no evidence left behind and her clothes had been removed. And so Cathcart actually said, the killer could be a cop. And so ultimately, Officer Owens was arrested for Sonia's murder. It would turn out that in the years Owens had lived in Nome, 6 local women had claimed he sexually assaulted them, and 2 of those women said they had filed formal reports with the Nome police, but nothing had ever been done about it. In Sonia's case, there was no evidence of assault or rape, but some officers believed Owens intended to sexually assault Sonia when he picked her up, but when she fought back, he killed her. Officer Matt Owens was convicted of murder and evidence tampering and sentenced to 101 years in prison with a chance for parole after 34 years. Sonia's murder shed further light on what many Alaska Native communities believed was a history of police neglect, harassment, and violence towards Alaska's indigenous population. And so, in 2007, the Sonia Ivanoff Act was signed into law in Alaska. That law states that any peace officer, firefighter, or correctional employee convicted of first-degree murder will receive a mandatory sentence of 99 years in prison. On the evening of Thursday, May 21st, 2015, a 16-year-old girl named Lily walked into the home gym inside of her house in Hong Kong looking to do a workout. Now, she sort of expected the gym would be empty and she could kind of have the run of the place, but as soon as she walked in, she saw her dad was in there and he was doing some sort of cool-down exercise on a yoga ball. So Lily's dad, whose name was Ka Kim Sun, was a doctor and a professional, and normally at this time of the day, she would never see him in the gym. He was typically locked upstairs in his study, or upstairs doing work or something, or he was just gone for the day. So for him to be here, it just didn't really line up with his schedule. And so Lily asked her dad, what are you doing here? What's going on? And her dad would tell her, well, actually, work at the hospital was really slow today, so I took off, I played some tennis with friends, and now I'm just doing some cool down exercises because I got nothing else to do. But I'll be out of your hair in a second. And sure enough, a couple of minutes later, her dad was up and out of the gym, and Lily just began her workout. The next day, May 22nd, around 1 o'clock, Lily was at home at her dining room table, sitting across from her mother, whose name was Wong Siu Fing, and Lily was eating a snack and staring at an open textbook. Now, normally at 1 o'clock on a Friday, Lily would be at school, but she had the day off that day. And she had wanted to spend her day off seeing friends and just being a teenager, but her dad was really focused on her being successful academically, and he told her that absolutely not. You're not going anywhere. You are going to stay home and you are going to study all day long. You will not leave the house. That's what you're doing. So Lily just continued to stare at the textbook and basically do what her father said. And then a couple of minutes later, she actually heard her dad coming down the stairs, and he came into the dining room, and he was clearly very pleased to see his daughter doing her work, or at least appearing to do her work. And he came over to her, gave her a kiss, he kissed their mother, and then he said he was off to work. And then he went out the door and he was gone. And as soon as Carl was gone, Lily's mom looked over at her and said, I'm not going to make you study all day. Come on, let's go out and have a mother-daughter shopping day. And Lily was stoked. She shut her textbook, she went and got ready, and then a minute later, she and her mom climbed into her mom's yellow Mini Cooper car and they headed out. About 2 hours later, around 4:15 p.m., a local jogger was running in the same neighborhood as where Lily and her family lived, and as they were running down the road, they noticed there was this yellow Mini Cooper car sitting on the side of the road, not moving, but it was still on. It was just sort of idling right there. And at first glance, it appeared there were people inside the car, but they weren't doing anything. They were just sitting there, not moving. And so the jogger was curious, and so they ran past and made a point to look inside the car, and they saw two women in the front two seats of this car slumped over. The two women were Lily and her mother. And so the jogger began to panic and banged on the glass to try to get the women to respond, but they didn't. And so a minute later, police were called. They dragged Lily and her mother out of the car. They were totally unresponsive. They were rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. They both died. The police would begin their investigation into their deaths by searching the yellow Mini Cooper car. And when they searched it, there really was nothing of note inside of it. I mean, the two women's purses were in the front of the car, there was some basic exercise equipment in the trunk, but the car was pristine, clean, not cluttered. I mean, there really was nothing in the car that gave away what could have happened to these two women. For the next 6 months, the police tirelessly looked for some lead as to what happened to this mother and daughter. They would interview all their friends and family. They would search their house top to bottom. They would basically take apart this Mini Cooper and look for, defects or flaws that maybe could have contributed to their death. I mean, they were looking everywhere, but it just didn't make sense. Nobody had any idea what happened to these two women. And so right as this case appeared like it was about to go cold, the detectives decided to just go back to the Mini Cooper and see if maybe, just maybe, they missed something. And sure enough, they had. It would turn out on May 22nd, 2015, the day that Lily and her mother died, Lily's father had told Lily to stay home and study, not because he cared about her academics. I mean, he did, but that day, the reason for this was not for that. Instead, he wanted her to stay home all day to protect her. When police originally searched Lily's mom's car, they found the two women's purses and also some basic exercise equipment in the trunk, specifically a deflated yoga ball. And at the time, the police didn't think anything of these items. They looked into them, they considered them, but they didn't seem to have any bearing on what happened to the women. However, it would turn out the yoga ball did have something to do with it. Specifically, 2 days before the women were found dead, that yoga ball was inside of Lily's home. It was in her home gym. In fact, when she walked into the home gym and saw her dad doing cool-down exercises and thought it was strange he was home right now, he was using that yoga ball. And Lily didn't think anything of it. But in reality, what her father was doing was not cool-down exercises. He had not just come home early and, had played tennis and this and that. In reality, he had taken that yoga ball to the hospital where he worked and filled it with carbon monoxide, an odorless, colorless, poisonous gas. And his plan was to put the yoga ball in his wife's car, unplug it, and now it's sealed and the gas is going to leak inside the car. And then when his wife got in the car and shut the door, she would effectively suffocate and die. He didn't try to kill his daughter, though. He wanted her to stay home and study, i.e., don't go with your mom and get in the car. But the mother defied the father, brought the daughter along, and then after driving for only a mile, the two women collapsed and died. Ka Kim's son was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. He has never explained his motive. Our next story is called 120 Times. In 2019, 21-year-old Samantha Josephson was a senior at the University of South Carolina. She was a brilliant student who aspired to be a lawyer. Specifically, she wanted to practice international law. And so in order to do that, she needed to be able to speak other languages besides English. And so during her college years, she had really leaned into Spanish and become quite good at it rather quickly. During her college Spanish studies, one of her professors was a woman named Daniela Jaimes. Daniela very quickly recognized in Samantha that she had this incredible intellect and work ethic and just knew she was destined for greatness. In fact, she compared Samantha to Amal Clooney, who is George Clooney's wife and is considered to be one of the most famous international lawyers ever. And so just out of a general interest to see Samantha succeed, Daniela offered to Samantha to kind of be there for her if she needed anything beyond just Spanish, that she was there to help her with law school applications, or if she needed advice on something, or if she just had ideas she wanted to bounce off of her, she would be available. And Samantha had taken her up on this offer, and by 2019, in Samantha's senior year, the pair had become very close, forming a sort of mentor-mentee relationship. Early that year, Samantha got accepted into her target law school, Drexel University in Pennsylvania. And so after telling her mother and father, Samantha ran to Daniela's office to tell her mentor the great news. And the two hugged and laughed and celebrated right there in the office. It was clear that everything was falling into place for Samantha, and Daniela was just very, very proud of her. A few weeks later, on March 29th, Samantha decided to go out with her friends for some drinks. Now, Samantha normally spent a lot of her time studying, even on the weekends, but since she was about a month away from graduation and she was already accepted to law school and really didn't have that much work since it was the end of the year anyways, she decided she could cut loose for that weekend. So she, along with her friends, head out to this downtown area called 5 Points, which is right near the University of South Carolina, and it's an area that's full of shops and restaurants and bars, so on the weekends it is packed with college students. Samantha and her friends hop from bar to bar, they're having a great time, and then around 2 a.m., the group found themselves in a bar called Bird Dog, and while they were there, because it was so crowded, the group of friends got separated. Now, initially, the friends were trying to reconnect with each other through texts and phone calls, but they were just really struggling to locate each other. And kind of in the middle of all that, Samantha decided that she was just too tired and didn't really feel like staying out any longer. And so she texted her friends and let them know that she was going to head back to her room. So Samantha leaves the Bird Dog bar on her own. She hops in an Uber and she starts driving back towards her campus. Several hours later, after all of Samantha's friends had also finally gone home and then woke up that following morning, they realized Samantha was not in her room. And so they called her, she didn't pick up. They started asking around to other friends who might know where she was, but no one did. And so pretty quickly, Samantha's friends were very, very worried about her because the last they had seen her, she was leaving the bar on her own. And so they were really worried something might have happened to her. And so by 1:30 p.m. that day, on that Saturday, the day after they had gone out, they called the police and reported her missing. At the same time that Samantha was reported missing, there were these two men who were in their mid-20s that were located 70 miles to the east of the University of South Carolina. They were out in this forest and they were hunting for turkeys. Earlier that day, these two men, whose names were Anders and Ryan, they had had no luck actually finding these birds, and so they were getting frustrated. And so by the afternoon, they had split up and were kind of combing this forest on their own to see if they would have more luck solo. And so Ryan, he posted up next to their truck, which was parked on this dirt road that was butted up against the edge of this big forest. And Ryan, with his binoculars, was scanning out across this field that butted up against the tree line of the forest. And he was kind of scanning the tree line, but he still was having no luck finding any turkeys. And then Anders, he actually had walked into that forest, which was right next to Ryan. And he was just kind of walking around looking for the birds as well, but he too was still having no luck. And so around 4:30 p.m., Anders, who's the one in the forest, he finally is just ready to admit defeat and leave empty-handed. And so he turns around and begins walking out of the forest in the direction of Ryan. And so at this point, he's maybe 100 or 200 feet away from Ryan, but the trees are very thick and they can't really see each other. And so Anders is just kind of walking in that direction. He's not looking for birds anymore, so he's not scouting around. He's just kind of looking straight ahead. And as he's walking, something catches his eye off to the left behind some trees. It was pretty far away, but he instinctively turned and looked, and he couldn't really tell what it was. It wasn't a turkey, but it wasn't anything that should have been in the forest. And so he decided he would go get a better look. And so he turned away from Ryan and went left and started cutting through the trees. And he kept walking until his view of this thing was no longer obscured by trees. And when he got a full look at this thing that had caught his attention, he stopped where he was. He yelled for Ryan, who couldn't see him, but he yelled for him to come into the woods and look at this. And as Ryan is running into the forest to see what's going on, Anders is pulling his phone out and calling the police. When the police finally show up, they find Anders and Ryan, and they're very shaken up, and they're sitting on the back of their truck on that dirt road where Ryan had been. And so the police pull up to them, they speak to them and get directions of how to get to what they saw inside of the forest. And then the police officers walk into the forest, they follow the directions, and before long, they're looking down at Samantha. 14 hours before her body was discovered, Samantha left the Bird Dog Bar and walked out front where there's lots of other students, and she walked to this corner of this road right in front of her, and she hailed an Uber. And then the Uber car pulls up, she hops inside, and then the car backs up and drives away. Except that was not an Uber car. That was a car driven by a 24-year-old named Nathaniel Rowland, who was not an Uber driver. He was a guy who had been driving around 5 Points all night, presumably to try to trick people into getting into his vehicle, believing it was an Uber. And finally, his plan had worked. He had pulled in right in front of Samantha. She thought it was her car. She climbed in without question. And then once she was inside, she couldn't get out again because the doors were child locked. There was no way to open them unless they were opened from the outside. Now, initially, Samantha wouldn't have noticed this. She just sat in the back seat, the car backed up, it started driving, except it didn't drive towards her campus. It drove the opposite direction. And the drive from this bar to the campus was only a couple of minutes long. And so even if she wasn't really paying attention, she would have recognized fairly quickly they were going the wrong way because, again, she's expecting to get dropped off within a couple of minutes. Now, we don't know what actually happened inside that car in terms of how Samantha actually handled this realization that he was taking her the wrong way. We don't know if she confronted him. We don't know if she tried to open the door and then realized it was child locked. We just don't know. All we know is that Nathaniel drove Samantha to some isolated area, most likely 70 miles to the east, near that forested area where her body was found. And then once he parked wherever he was, Nathaniel pulled out a knife and then leapt into the back seat of his car where Samantha was trapped, and he stabbed her 120 times. And then after he was finished stabbing her, it would take Samantha over 10 minutes to finally die. Within hours of dumping her body in the forest, Nathaniel was posting these normal posts on Facebook of him in front of his car and regular status updates, and he was having very normal interactions with his family and his friends, as if he was completely unaffected by this horrible crime he had just committed. Nathaniel was arrested within 24 hours of the discovery of Samantha's body. While he never offered any motive for the crime, it's believed he simply decided that night he was going to go kill someone. And so he just began prowling around for a victim, and unfortunately, Samantha was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nathaniel was ultimately convicted of her murder and was sentenced to life in prison. The next and final story of today's episode is called To Save His Soul. On the evening of September 17th, 2021, a 42-year-old preacher named Jason Thornburg was cleaning up his motel room in Euless, Texas, which is a small city between Dallas and Fort Worth. Jason was going to be hosting a small Bible study group in his motel room in a few minutes, and even though really it was not that dirty, he was really taking time to ensure it was as clean and inviting as he could possibly make it. So normally, Jason would host these Bible study groups at his house, but unfortunately, Jason's house burned down just that past summer and he lost everything. But Jason was so committed to God and spreading the word of God that he still wanted to continue having these Bible study groups, even if it meant, doing it in this kind of crummy motel room. And so Jason walked around the room, picking up laundry and straightening up his bed, and then after kind of arranging chairs in a circle for the various participants he was expecting, he went over to a cabinet, pulled out some Bibles, and right as he was about to start placing these Bibles on each chair, he heard a knock at the door. And Jason was really excited because he knew that had to be someone who was here for this Bible study. And so he walked right over, Bibles in hand, to the door, he opened it up, and standing outside the door was this big guy covered in tattoos, kind of looking down at Jason, and Jason broke into a big smile. He was so happy to see this guy. The man's name was David Luaris, and Jason had previously met him when he was out on the street doing outreach for his church, and he had invited David to, anytime he wanted to come by the motel and be a part of this Bible study group. Now, Jason knew that David was really not the kind of guy who went to church or really showed any real interest in God or, the Bible, but, Jason took all kinds, and he was just hopeful that maybe David would show up someday. And now, here David was. However, David told Jason that the reason he was here was actually not for the Bible study group. He was here because he was in the middle of a crisis and he didn't know where else to turn. He confessed to Jason that he had begun using drugs and gotten mixed up in some criminal activity, and there's some dangerous people out there that he was sort of running with, and now his concern was some of those dangerous people were coming to get him. And so he literally felt like his life was in danger. Now, when Jason heard this, he was surprised, but at the same time, he could tell that David was being very authentic and just needed help. And Jason felt like, his job ultimately was to serve God and all of God's people. And David was one of those people, and he was in need of help. And so if all Jason did was simply provided safe haven for David inside of this motel room, then that was serving God and it was the right thing to do. And so Jason immediately said, "No problem, David." He handed him a Bible and said, "Come on in." David took the Bible awkwardly and just kind of stood there for a moment, not really sure what to do. But then Jason said, "Hey, relax, just come inside, take a seat." And so David did. He walked in, he sat down with the Bible, and then Jason actually came over and sat down next to him, and the two of them, for about 15 minutes, just made kind of awkward small talk. Jason could tell, David is completely on edge. He was staring at the door, which was now closed, and he just clearly was very anxious and paranoid, and Jason really wasn't talking about the Bible or God or anything. He was just, trying to calm David down and show him that this was a safe place. And then after about 15 minutes of this, when David had somewhat calmed down, and also by this point, nobody else had showed up for this Bible study group, Jason decided, okay, you know what, maybe I'll just begin the Bible study with David. It kind of gives us something to do. And so Jason got up, he locked the door, showing David that it's just going to be them, it's safe here. And he told David to go ahead and open his Bible to a certain page. And then the two of them just began reading the Bible together. And for hours, they just sat there reading the Bible, and Jason spoke to David about, teachings of God and how to lead your life in a way to serve other people. And, for the most part, David did completely calm down and seemed to really be embracing this Bible study. But eventually, despite how well this Bible study was going, it did need to come to an end at some point, at least in Jason's mind. And when he began to notice it was getting dark outside, he sort of began wrapping it up, and he shut his Bible and sort of expected that David would take a hint and leave, but David didn't. Instead, when David began to realize that, hey, this is over now and it's time for you to go, David looked at Jason and begged him to please let him stay in this room overnight, that he can't go out there, it's not safe for him. Now, Jason knew he did have some level of responsibility for David. I mean, David had told him he was in danger, he had already invited him inside and was basically providing safe haven for him, and it did feel kind of wrong to be like, now go back out there. But at the same time, Jason felt a little uneasy. I mean, he didn't really know David. He didn't really understand the situation. And so there was some hesitation at first, but after looking again at David and seeing how desperate he was to just please stay here overnight, Jason said, okay, you can stay. So Jason grabbed some extra blankets and pillows and created a makeshift bed on the floor. And then after that, the two of them actually reopened their Bibles and just began reading some more from the Bible for a couple more hours, basically another round of Bible study. But eventually, they both were very tired, so they put their Bibles down, they said goodnight, they each climbed into their beds, and they closed their eyes and fell asleep. For the next 5 days, Jason's motel room remained mostly closed, and the only thing anybody heard coming from his room was gospel music, and it was being played at a very high volume basically the entire time, to the point where other residents of this motel began to complain about how loud the music was. However, the owner of the motel was getting these complaints from residents who were only there for, hours at a time or days at a time. And, the room they're complaining about, Jason's room, he was a long-term resident and so had a sort of higher priority with the owner. And so the owner just didn't feel like bothering Jason. He wanted him to stay and keep paying for that room. And so the owner didn't do anything about the noise complaints. And also, the owner did know that his motel had sort of a seedy reputation. And so, generally speaking, he didn't really care too much about the music to begin with. And so over the course of these 5 days, the music kept on blasting, and really the only other thing of note, again, that happened in this period of time, was that these two other people entered Jason's motel room and didn't leave either. So basically there's 4 people in the room, they haven't come out again, super loud music, that's all going on for 5 days. And then on the 5th day, the morning of September 22nd, a single person walked out of Jason's motel room, and they were wearing a full-body hazmat suit and carrying some sort of luggage. And they would leave the motel, get in a car, and drive away. 45 minutes later, about 25 miles away from that motel, the Fort Worth Fire Department got a call about this raging dumpster fire in a residential neighborhood. Firefighters quickly got to the scene and put out the blaze, and after it was gone, they walked up to the smoky dumpster and looked inside just to get a look at what was burning, and what they saw caused them all to back up and call the police. It would turn out David was right when he said he was in danger. However, what he didn't understand is hiding out in Jason's motel room was not going to protect him from that danger. Shortly after he and Jason wrapped up that second Bible study that night, and the two of them climbed into their respective beds, Jason in his actual bed and David in the makeshift bed on the floor, well, David did fall asleep pretty quickly, but Jason didn't. Jason waited until David was asleep, and then Jason got up, got a knife, and then slit David's throat. Then he cut David's heart out and ate it, because Jason the preacher really actually believed that human sacrifice was the best and purest way to serve God. Over the course of the next 5 days after killing David, Jason would remain in his motel room blasting gospel music, and over those 5 days, he would basically lure those 2 women into his room, very likely on the promise of Bible study, but they too would be sacrificed. And then on the 5th day, the person who exited the motel room in the full hazmat suit was Jason, and that luggage he was carrying with him contained the body parts of the 3 people he had just killed. And he brought those body parts to that dumpster in that residential neighborhood and lit them on fire. And so when the firefighters put out the fire, what they saw inside were burned up bodies. Jason was arrested, and while he was awaiting trial, he confessed that David and the two women were not actually his first victims. He said that just a few years earlier, he had sacrificed his girlfriend, and that house fire that destroyed all of his belongings and prompted him to go live in this motel was set by Jason himself, because he had sacrificed his roommate and needed to get rid of the evidence. Ultimately, law enforcement was only able to show that Jason killed those 5 people, but there could have been more. Jason was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. He is currently on death row in Texas. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.
There's a quiet little tremble every time you look my way. Like the world begins to soften into colors I can't quite explain. You speak in gentle rhythms that my heartbeat learns to trace. And suddenly the chaos falls in line around your face. I don't know how you pull me in so effortlessly, but every breath you take rewrites my gravity.
The MrBallen's podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone, research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden.